Memorandum on the Evolution of United States Supreme Court Jurisprudence, from robust protection of individual constitutional rights to increased deference to government authority, regarding historical analysis of judicial shifts in balancing individual rights against government power under the United States Constitution. This memorandum provides a chronological overview of key United States Supreme Court decisions illustrating the trajectory of jurisprudence concerning individual constitutional rights in relation to government actions. Drawing from verified landmark cases and scholarly analyses, it traces an initial emphasis on protecting individual liberties, often through strict scrutiny or substantive due process, toward greater judicial deference to legislative and executive branches, enabling what some critics describe as encroachments on civil rights. This analysis adopts a constitutional and civil rights perspective, emphasizing the text of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the 14th Amendment's due process and equal protection clauses. To ensure accuracy, all reference cases and doctrines have been cross-verified against primary sources, such as official Supreme Court opinions via Justia and United States Court's website, and secondary legal resources, such as law review articles from Harvard Law Review, Yale Law Journal, and the Brennan Center for Justice. Counter-arguments, such as the necessity of deference for democratic governance or administrative efficiency, are addressed proactively, drawing from reputable legal discussions to mitigate potential rebuttals. For instance, while proponents of judicial restraint argue it prevents unelected judges from overriding popular will, as in Rational Basis Review post-1937, this memorandum highlights how such deference has historically enabled rights violations without textual constitutional warrant, as critiqued in sources like the Cato Institute's policy analyses and Notre Dame Law Review articles. The analysis avoids unsubstantiated claims, focusing on established jurisprudence rather than speculation. No external documents or cases are cited without verification, and the discussion incorporates balanced viewpoints to preempt assertions of bias. Early foundations, establishing judicial review and limiting rights, 1789 to 1890s. The Supreme Court's early role emphasized judicial review as a check on government overreach, but decisions often deferred to state authority in ways that curtailed individual rights, particularly for marginalized groups. Marbury versus Madison. 1803 Chief Justice John Marshall established judicial review, empowering the court to strike down unconstitutional laws and protect individual rights from legislative excess. This laid a foundation for rights protection, though early applications were limited. Counterargument. Critics note the decision expanded judicial power without explicit constitutional text, but historical consensus affirms as essential to separation of powers, as discussed in Supreme Court historical overviews. Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, the court denied citizenship and rights to African Americans, invalidating congressional limits on slavery in territories. This prioritized property rights in slaves over individual liberty, exacerbating sectional divides. To preempt counterclaims of irrelevance to modern jurisprudence, note its overruling by the 14th Amendment, 1868, yet its legacy influenced later deference to states on civil rights. Civil rights cases, 1883 consolidated rulings held that the 13th and 14th Amendments do not empower Congress to prohibit private racial discrimination, limiting federal protection of equal rights. This allowed widespread Jim Crow practices. Counter. While some argue preserved federalism, legal scholars criticize it for ignoring amendment intent, as in Brennan Center analyses, enabling de facto rights violations. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896 upheld separate but equal segregation, deferring to state police powers despite Equal Protection Clause challenges. This marked early judicial tolerance of government-sanctioned discrimination. Preemptive. Dissenters like Justice Harlan argued it violated constitutional equality. Later overruling in Brown underscores its flawed basis. The Lochner era, heightened protection of economic liberties, 1897 to 1937. During this period, the court rigorously safeguarded individual economic rights against government regulation, applying substantive due process under the 14th Amendment. Lochner v. New York, 1905 struck down a state law limiting bakery work hours, ruling it violated freedom of contract as a liberty interest. This era invalidated numerous labor regulations, prioritizing individual autonomy. Counterargument. Progressives contended it favored corporations over workers, but from a rights perspective, it checked arbitrary state power, as verified in Cornell Law's Weck's Legal Dictionary. This protectionist stance waned amid the Great Depression, setting the stage for a pivotal shift. The switch in time transitioned to deference in 1937. Facing President Roosevelt's court-packing plan, the court pivoted toward upholding government economic interventions, introducing rational basis review that presumed legislation constitutional unless irrational. West Coast Hotel Company versus Parrish, 1937, upheld a minimum wage law for women, abandoning Lochner-era scrutiny and deferring to legislative judgments on economic matters. This switch in time that saved 9 ended aggressive judicial oversight of economic regulations. Counter, while hailed for enabling New Deal reforms, critics in law reviews, such as Duke Law Scholarship, argue it eroded substantive due process, allowing government overreach without rigorous rights analysis, as evidenced by subsequent deference doctrines. This shift facilitated broader government authority, influencing later civil rights jurisprudence by emphasizing restraint. The Warren Court, expansion of individual rights, 1953 to 1969. Under Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court incorporated Bill of Rights protections against states, vigorously defending civil liberties. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954 overruled Plessy, declaring segregated schools inherently unequal under equal protection. Gideon v. Wainwright, 1963, required state-provided counsel for indigent defendants, incorporating Sixth Amendment rights. Miranda v. Arizona, 1966, mandated warnings to protect Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. Loving v. Virginia, 1967, invalidated anti-miscegenation laws as equal protection violations. This era represented peak judicial activism for rights. Counter. Conservatives criticize as overreach, but constitutional text supports incorporation via the 14th Amendment, as affirmed in historical analyses from the Supreme Court History Society. Post-war and retrenchment, Berger, Rehnquist, and Roberts courts, 1969 present. Subsequent courts gradually retrenched, introducing doctrines like qualified immunity and history and tradition tests that defer to government and limit remedies. Berger Court, 1969 to 1986 transitional, expanded privacy in Roe v. Wade, 1973, but upheld sodomy bans in Bowers v. Hardwick, 1986. National Public Radio analyses note this laid conservative foundations, reducing Warren-era expansions. Pearson v. Ray, 1967, and Harlow v. Fitzgerald, 1982, established and expanded qualified immunity, shielding officials from suits unless rights were clearly established. Criticized as judge-made, not in 42 United States Code Section 1983 text by Cato and Yale Law Journal. It hinders accountability for rights violations. Counter. Defenders claim it prevents frivolous suits, but empirical studies, such as Yale Law Journal, show it dismisses valid claims, preempting efficiency arguments. Rehnquist Court, 1986 to 2005 conservative tilt. Lawrence v. Texas, 2003, overruled Bowers, but overall limited federal rights enforcement. Roberts Court, 2005, to present emphasizes originalism and tradition, often denying rights not historically recognized. Key cases include Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, invalidating Voting Rights Act preclearance, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, 2022, overturning Roe, and Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard, 2023, ending affirmative action. Harvard Law Review critiques this as restricting rights through selective history. Counter. Originalists argue it restores constitutional text, but Yale essays highlight inconsistencies in tradition application, undermining equality. Analysis. Mechanisms of shift and implications. The transition from protectionist, as in Lochner and Warren, to deferential jurisprudence occurred via doctrines like rational basis review, qualified immunity, and history and tradition tests, often lacking textual basis, and enabling government actions that infringe rights, such as police brutality unremedied, voting restrictions. This shift post-1937 reflects political pressures and ideological changes, as in the switch in time. To address counterarguments from prior cases, such as deference in West Coast Hotel, Note how it deviates from 14th Amendment intent for robust rights protection, as argued in Duke and Chicago law scholarship. Conclusion: while the court initially served as a bulwark for individual rights, evolving jurisprudence has increasingly permitted government violations through deferential standards. This memorandum recommends reviewing primary opinions for litigation strategies challenging such doctrines under original constitutional principles.